Greetings everyone, I am Jaskirat Singh Gujral and I welcome you all to the latest episode of Candid Diplomacy, an interview series where we host esteemed guests from the field of IR, diplomacy and politics, brought to you by Diplomania, the flagship society of Jindal School of International Affairs. Today, we have with us a personality who is not just the most favorite professors at JSIA, but also an expert in the field of China studies, Professor Dr. Sriparna Pathak. Dr. Sriparna Pathak is an Associate Professor and Associate Dean of Admissions at the Jindal School of International Affairs at Jindal Global University. She is also the founding director of the Center for Northeast Asian Studies at JSIA. She teaches courses on the foreign policy of China as well as theories of international relations. Her previous work experience covers the Ministry of External Affairs, where she worked as consultant for the Policy Planning and Research Division, working on China's domestic and foreign policies. Awarded a doctorate from the Center for East Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University in 2015, Dr. Pathak is fluent in English, Mandarin and Indian languages such as Hindi, Bengali and Assamese. She's been a recipient of the Joint Fellowship awarded by the Ministry of Human Resource Development, India and the China Scholarship Council, Government of the People's Republic of China. And she spent 2 years in China actively researching various aspects of China's domestic economy. Her areas of interest are China's domestic economy, trade and economic relations between India and China's foreign policy and economic linkages with the world. We welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you, Jaskirat.
So, Professor, we'll start with the questions immediately. My first question would be, why did you choose China as a topic of research? And did you wish to pursue anything apart from China before you settled on China as a topic?
Okay, interesting questions. I'll divide it into roughly three reasons. So my master's was in international relations from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and just the way it is in most universities of the world and here teaching courses on IR, I had electives even on China and other parts of the world. But before that, when I was in first year masters, there was a short trip which I made to Dharamshala/McLeodganj. During the first year, I didn't have electives. So, but I knew all these principles of economics, etc. So I was armed with all these sorts of things like consumer surplus, economies of scale. When I do end up in McLeodganj, and it's a nice little place, and it's bubbling, it's got a lot of new things. I saw a lot of shops from where I wanted to go and shop. But in a lot of shops I saw, there's this sign which says, "We do not sell products made in China." That was a bit absurd for me, because in my head it was like, but why not? Economies of scale, because the seller will of course get a lot of profit because cheap prices, etc. Why not? Is there something else? So I went and asked one of the shopkeepers, and I said, why would you not? And I tried explaining consumer surplus to him just the way a young 20-plus-year-old would do. He said, beta, to answer your question, I'll have to ask you a couple of questions. I said, sure. So he said, are you from McLeodganj? I said, no, I live in Delhi. But yeah, my home is in Jamshedpur in Jharkhand. He said, okay. So if tomorrow someone comes and tells you that you have to stay in Delhi forever, you cannot go back to Jamshedpur, how would you feel? I was like, that's absurd. That would never happen. And he's like, no, if it would happen, what would you do? I said, I would do everything to go back to my family, to my home, because home is home. And he said, what if certain people or a certain government would not allow you to go home? I was like, I would do everything to go back, because home is home. Home is where the heart is. So he said, exactly. That's the reason why I would not sell the products of a country that is occupying my homeland, and that is China. That stayed with me. And I kept analyzing the question over and over again in my head. So when it was time to take up electives, I did take up a lot of electives on China. That was the first reason. When I did take up electives on China, I realized that India and China once upon a time were called the Hindi-Chini bhai-bhai. Now, giving the pedestal of a brother means that that country or that entity is really close to one's heart. Otherwise, you don't confer the title of a family member to it. But then what really went wrong? That 1962 happened, that was just one point. Something must have gone wrong. So I wanted to find out more. So, which is why I decided I'll take more electives. I'll stick to China studies during my MPhil, and then I will go and learn the language. I will live there because I need to understand what exactly has happened. When it finally came to my MPhil dissertation topic, I decided to focus on the Chinese economy, which kept my interest going further and further on China. Because originally I come from the steel city of India, also the green city of India. Despite being the steel city, it is also the green city, which means that it's managed sustainability really well. And the Tatas are known across not just India, but across the world. So in fact, the Tata Group, and Taiwan's PPSMC is going to spearhead the establishment of India's first semiconductor fab in Gujarat. This was something which was announced yesterday. So what stuck to me was that how is the model of Jamshedpur's development different from that of the Chinese developmental model? Are there similarities? Are there differences? Can we use this and leverage this for India? So these are the three reasons which kept me stuck to China. And then the more I studied, the more interested I got. So it got me stuck to it forever.
If I may ask a small question from my side as well. You mentioned that you were interested in economics as well in your beginning. But earlier you also mentioned that you had a background in journalism. So before China, were you interested in a more economic outlook at journalism towards the world?
During my bachelor's in journalism, we had a lot of papers. I figured that I'm the best in all the IR papers. I did better in those papers than what I did in, say, Indian politics or party system, etc. So I knew that there is something in IR, in international politics, which attracts me, which makes me better. It comes more naturally to me. That was one reason. Then I did try to be a journalist because we had to do internships. And I realized I don't fare very well because I don't have that sort of a quick-witted approach to coming up with questions. B, I would have to start with domestic politics, which is not my forte. So which is why I decided I'm going to stick to international politics per se, which is why I chose IR as my master's in JNU.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So our next question is, what stand do you think India would take if the Chinese were to suddenly invade Taiwan, considering that our stance has usually been of strategic autonomy in the ongoing global conflicts?
So currently, there is one thing which dominates our foreign policy thinking, and that is the fact that we have been locked in a conflict with the PLA since 2020. So there is a humongous amount of personnel and resources which has gone in tackling the Western Theatre Command of the People's Liberation Army. We cannot leave that border unprotected, especially when there's an onslaught from the PLA. That is the first and foremost thing. Now, if there were to be another regional conflict, and Xi Jinping has mentioned regional conflicts, not regional conflict, in his 20th Party Congress speech, conflicts, focus being on plurals, regional conflicts. The region is India, the region is within also Taiwan. So there is a humongous possibility that there will be conflict. What can India really do? First, we can't leave our own sovereignty unprotected and jump headlong into protecting someone else's sovereignty or claims to sovereignty. First is that. Sovereignty, unfortunately, still is the dominant mantra in international politics, so India will have to protect it. We cannot let the borders go unprotected. That being said, we are holding a significant number of WTC, Western Theatre Command personnel down, which could have been used in the theatre conflict with Taiwan. Heavens forbid, if this happens, it is going to be a headache for us. Because a lot of trade passes through, and India is also leveraging its status as a manufacturing hub on economics. So India will have to pay certain amount of attention. Militarily being present is not an option at the moment. That being said, there is the COMCASA or the LEMOA agreements with the US, which have been signed way ahead in time. If heavens forbid, there is an economic blockade of Taiwan, if there is a full-blown conflict over Taiwan, the US will expect India to keep its end of the deal. And India has kept its end of the deal in every agreement. So there will be logistics exchange, maybe there will be refueling, if American warships, airships want to refuel. There will be intelligence sharing, etc. India and Taiwan have had certain exchanges about on Navy personnel exchanges, etc. So the idea is there to foresee a sort of conflict and to prepare. But militarily intervening is something which India cannot afford because India's own borders need to be protected. But India will be there in some format.
If I may ask a follow-up to this, what makes Xi Jinping confident that his military or his government's military can take on multiple, as he mentioned, regional conflicts and come out successful? Because if we look upon history, even the Korean War came to a stalemate, and aggression against Vietnam, especially after the Vietnam War, did not end in a full victory for China. So what drives Xi Jinping's confidence that this time China will be able to come out victorious?
So Xi Jinping is not 100% sure that it will come out victorious, which is why all the conflicts it's engaging in are of limited nature. It's not a full-blown conflict. That's why we don't use the term war when describing conflicts between India and China. It's more like a border skirmish or a border conflict. Because as you said, 1979 was the last experience that the PLA had of a full-blown conflict in which the PLA did not fare really well. Second, it's not just Qin Gang who is missing. There are a lot of others from the PLA rocket force in particular who are also missing or are being questioned, etc. So it's not like there is 100% discipline in various facets of the PLA. Third, Xi Jinping has been constantly mentioning the need for discipline in the PLA. Why? There has to be a reason why it is being said so many times by Xi Jinping, by the president of the country. This is why there is not a full-fledged conflict. Even in the last 2 days, Taiwan's Ministry of Defense has stated that China is escalating again. But it's just escalations to psychologically create a sort of fear, to create a sort of imagery, to create a sort of impression that China or Chinese PLA is superior. If it really could afford it, there would have been a fully blown military conflict by now, either in Taiwan or in India. But that thankfully is not the case yet.
Thank you. So our third question comes to a more economic aspect. India is aiming to become a leading economic power. We have made goals of 10 trillion and at least $1 trillion economies, and are looking towards expanding our GDP and global standing, especially as a global manufacturing hub with Make in India and Atmanirbhar Bharat. How probable is this against the rise of China and its already established economic dominance, especially in areas of interest for India, such as Africa and Latin America?
Extremely interesting question. See, there are certain conditions which are prevailing currently which we cannot ignore while answering this question. The first is that the economic outlook for China's growth is extremely bleak, extremely low. It's not just from 2024 that this is the case. Back in 2013 is when Xi Jinping had talked about the new normal in the Chinese economy, which basically meant that there's not going to be a double-digit growth rate, 10% and above, like it used to be before 2012 and so on. So, as per principles of economics, every country goes through this, there will be a stabilization. But the thing is, it's not stabilized, it's decreasing. And given the fact that Xi Jinping, just like Mao Zedong, is more of a person who is politics in command rather than being like Deng Xiaoping, who was more of a person who thought of economics in command, the crackdowns on tech, housing property rising, etc. These are derailing the Chinese economic growth rates further. Problems of unemployment, low consumption rates, and so on. There are no short-term fixes for the Chinese economy. As opposed to that, India is the bright spot in the global economy right now. In the fourth quarter also, as was announced yesterday, we've had a 7.5% plus growth rate, which is not the case for any other country in the world. India has the biggest population in the world, which can be a liability but can be a huge source of advantage. India also has positive demographics. India has the youngest population in the world. With that comes in innovation, with that comes step up in technology, and so on. In space also, we've been making a lot of strides. I just mentioned in the first, as an answer to the first question, the Tatas and Taiwan's, PSMMC coming together and setting up the fab bit of India's first semiconductor, attempt in Gujarat. These things are happening. Make in India has been there. Maybe it's not been able to take off. Maybe it's going to take off now. Again, one more facet to consider is that the BrahMos missile sale, which happened because of the focus of the Indian government on strengthening its own defense, has happened. There are positives. India's economy right now has a very positive momentum. What needs to be ensured is that we stick to the ground, we make sure that this takes off. Will there be challenges from China? Yes, of course, because China's rise in the international system has been on the back of its economic growth rate. China was known as the manufacturing platform of the world. Every single thing, almost every single thing is made in China. India is trying to leverage the same sort of economic power. If you look at our outreach to Southeast Asia and the sorts of goods that we are trying to sell through our Act East program, a lot of those are similar to what China sells to Southeast Asian countries. So there's going to be a competition. China needs markets. Will it give way so easily to India? Not so easily. That's a challenge. So we need to think on these lines. Things are positive for the Indian economy, for India as a country right now. How we understand the challenges from China and take it forward is something that remains to be seen. Hopefully, we will fare well.
Correct, ma'am. Just a small follow-up to this as well. As we mentioned multiple times now, the superconductor factory that's now coming up in Gujarat. And as you've also mentioned, that Xi Jinping is now more of a political leader as compared to an economic leader like Deng Xiaoping was. Do you believe that India now has a opportunity to strike the iron while it's hot in the global race for superconductors, where Taiwan is already leading and is currently being pursued by the United States? Do you feel that India can also grab that market and therefore boost its economy through a modern tech manufacturing hub, like become a modern tech manufacturing hub?
There was a cabinet meeting yesterday in which a lot of decisions on semiconductors were taken. This bit about Tatas and the PSMMC also came out yesterday. Foxconn is definitely interested. On India's Republic Day this year, we did give the Bharat Ratna to Foxconn's Yang Liu, because we need to recognize the contributions of people, not just in politics, but economics as well. So which is why India is taking this component very seriously. We have found a lot of critical minerals as well, which can leverage our growth further. In addition to Taiwan, there are a lot of other countries as well, which are actively investing in India. India is also looking at these countries so that we can understand and manufacturing chips, which are critical components, better. And we can take not just make in India further, but we can also think about leveraging our, the sort of potentials we have in chip manufacturing, the sort of potentials we have in innovation and so on. So there is a lot of churning happening right now. And the Indian economy seems to be picking up. But of course, there are hurdles, because for Taiwanese companies which have been used to working in China, the governance structure is completely different. It's not a democracy. Whereas in a democracy, there'll be a lot of back and forth in the parliament and so on. So Taiwanese companies also need to understand that, and India per se also needs to ensure that it can explain these differences in a much better way, so that the cooperation actually is long-term and is sustainable. But overall, the direction is good.
So our final question for the day, ma'am. Is there any advice you would like to give to upcoming and budding China enthusiasts, not just in universities, but in maybe areas such as the military or the government? Again, people who are now taking an interest in China through either personal or generally geopolitical courses.
So there is definitely an urgent need for China watchers in India, because you might take whichever lens. China as a competition, China as a partner, whichever lens you take, you need to understand the country. Only then can you understand the complementarities or the differences that we have with China. In whatever way that one wants to impact international relations, as a risk consultant or as a foreign policy analyst, As someone from the track too, as someone from the media, academia or so on, there is a need to understand China. How do you understand China? Merely understanding what Chinese policies are in 2023, 2024 is not enough. There is always a big connect between what has happened in the past and what is happening right now. BRI, where did the concept of the BRI or the Silk Road come in from? China leverages its history. There are certain challenges. How did, maybe India, or how did China see its challenges? How did it work on it? What was the foreign policy which came forth? If, say, countries which are in conflict, like India or Taiwan, if we can understand that, it works to our own advantage. So one needs to understand China in a holistic way, understand its history, its geography, its culture, its foreign policy, economy, and the language. I'll give you an example of the language. We all are products of our history, so which is why very often when in India we meet each other, because we've been colonized by the British, we end up talking about the weather. It's too hot, it's too cold, etc. For the Chinese, when you do go or when you do speak the language, you'll realize that they, after saying hi, they'll also ask you, have you had food? Why do they do that? Because they've had a very tumultuous history under Mao Zedong, because of which hundreds of thousands of people died during the Great Leap Forward to begin with. There were massive famines. So which is why as neighbors, when people would meet each other, they would ask genuinely if you've had food or not. If you've not, maybe we can share with you. There's a need to understand this. And there are so many other things. You might hear of, walking on two-leg strategy. What exactly is that? That has certain implications for the directions China or Chinese economy might take now. What does crossing the river by feeling the stones mean? What does hide your power and bide your time mean? So these are aspects which have an intersection between history and economics, but these are essential to understand. So we need to understand it holistically. Language, either learn, now we have AI tools, we have the technology generation, somehow try to grasp the basics. Because even in India, if there's a proverb which I say in Hindi, it cannot be translated 100% accurately into English. Nach na jane angan tera. Does not know to dance, but no, I don't. Yeah, doesn't make sense, right? So a lot of things you try and understand it better. When you do understand the language, so leverage AI, leverage technology, or go to Taiwan or PRC if you want to, go and learn. There is this fear associated with the language, that it is one of the most difficult languages of the world. But trust me, it is not, especially for South Asians. Because we already speak so many languages. Our mother tongue might be something else, second language in school, first language would be English, second language would be something else. So at any point we are at least dealing with 3 languages. So that makes the comprehension of the language easier. Grammatical structure, you will find some similarity with some language at least. So there's a need to move beyond that fear and learn the language as well, in addition to history, basically studying it holistically as an area study. It's not just important that you study it as a partner, as India's partner maybe, or as a competitor. So studying it holistically would be important. Why is it that the US has so many diplomats who can speak the language, who have probably lived in China? Similarly for academicians, students and so on. There has to be a reason. If you want to deal with an adversary or even partner with a friend, you need to know that person, entity, country. So I would just say that we need more China watchers in India, and I hope more people take up China as an area study.
Yes, ma'am. If I may ask you a final question from my side. Given the historical precedence of India-China relations going way back beyond the CCP and the 1949 victory over the KMT, what would you say are the outlooks for India-China relations in the future? Would there be further fighting, or would there be another area of detente as we had with Deng Xiaoping and our prime ministers?
The border conflict is not going away. If it had to go away, it would have gone away by now. In all the pronouncements, China talks about maintenance of the border, not resolution of the border. So we have a clear-cut understanding by now. We've had 62, 67, we've had 87, we've had Doklam, we've had Galwan, we've had Arunachal Pradesh last to last term, and so on. These many conflicts, which neighbor has had? No other country has had. So conflict is here to stay. It's a permanent, unfortunately, it's a permanent feature of our relationship. And it's a claim on our sovereignty. Sovereignty is important for any country in the world. In order to further other such outlooks like economic partnership, climate negotiations, staying together, sticking together, standing up to neo-colonial gestures of the West, etc. Before doing all of that, any country needs to exist first. Bartering of sovereignty is not acceptable. The sort of approach that China has had to India has been very clear in the last, since 2020 onwards. But even a more recent thing, last year after China came up with its standardized map, in which yet again it showed Indian territories as part of its own and furthered the 9-dash line into the 10-dash line. When India did say that this has no logical grounding, other countries also said that. The diktat from China was that India should not read too much into it. It did not say the same thing for other countries which also had an issue. There was only one country's name, which is India's. So the approach is very, very clear. China wants India as a partner, but at the cost of Indian sovereignty, as a second-rate player, as a subsidiary partner. That doesn't work for an India which has self-respect, and that does not work for an India which wants partnership on equal terms. So it's very clear that conflict is here to stay. Our MEA, our EAM has said it multiple times that the boundary question has to, or there has to be a movement back to the pre-2020 situation. Unless that happens, things are not moving forward. So this frozen situation is going to stay. Because Xi Jinping is here to stay for some more time, and given the fact that India has also found its own voice, its own place now, losing face doesn't work for Xi Jinping, losing face for India also doesn't work. So unfortunately, conflict is here to stay.
So thank you so much, ma'am. That is all from our side. Thank you so much for your insight and candidacy with regards to the topic, and we look forward to seeing and hearing more from you in the future. Thank you so much, ma'am.